Good evening and welcome to ADI's webinar series. Thank you for joining us today as we talk about grading strategies in ADI. If you haven't already, please check out our social media, which you can see in the lower left-hand corner of the screen here for updates, tips, and to see how other teachers are utilizing ADI. Let's go over a little bit about how you can interact with us throughout the webinar. At the bottom of your screen, there's a question and answer icon. Feel free to submit your questions about grading strategies in ADI. Your question may be selected to be answered at the end of the webinar during the Q&A section. If this is the case, your question will be marked Answered Live. We will also be taking additional questions about ADI in a more informal setting after we end this session. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website as well as our social media platforms for later viewing or sharing. Any links that are shared during or after the webinar will be included in the description and or sent to webinar participants via email. So let me go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Jennifer Kashuba, and I am the Professional Learning Coordinator for ADI. I'm also a graduate student working with Vic Sampson at UT Austin. I love working with districts as they implement ADI and providing support for teachers throughout their implementation process. I'm also really excited to introduce to you our professional learning specialist who will be your facilitator today for the Grading Strategies webinar. Carrie Burt used ADI in her classroom as one of the authors on the 5th grade ADI book, which is anticipated out next fall.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to get myself unmuted there. So excited to be here, excited to be talking to everyone. We've got two big goals for this workshop. One of them is to kind of go through and talk about some big picture decisions. Another one is to talk about some assessment options as you're going to grade your ADIs. So before we get started with that, I wanted to kind of talk through some of the formative and summative grading practices that might be helpful. So I wanted to bring this up. This is going to lay the foundation for all of the work that we are doing. Formative grades are going to be grades where you are kind of assessing what the kids are doing, but with a purpose of helping them figure out what's next, helping push them into the next step. And those are, can be formal. You can do that in a formal way. They can also be more informal, conversation based. A summative assessment, that's going to be your end of the time period assessment where you're really looking at, did they get what we were trying to do or not? So you can kind of take different pieces of ADI and use them formatively or summatively, but I just wanted to have that kind of definition laid out for everyone before we get started. This is what I'm meaning when I say formative and summative as we go. So the first thing we want to talk about here is grades versus feedback. In my own classroom, I found I was giving a lot of time, I was spending a lot of time giving my kids feedback. And then when it came time for them to actually do the next ADI lab, they were making the exact same mistake. So I was spending hours and hours looking at all of their work, writing comments and that kind of thing. And I found that I don't know, it wasn't time well spent. And my mistake was that I was giving them a grade and then trying to have them somehow, I don't know, want to go back and look at it after they've gotten that grade. And research says that like grades should be one small piece of the picture that you're giving. And ADI has lots and lots of opportunities for students to receive feedback from their peers and from the teacher in ways that aren't tied to a grade. And then a few places where it's going to make more sense to maybe if you need grades to take them in certain places. Before you really get started on deciding that, you want to decide what you are going to be assessing. So different districts have different policies that they use, and that's totally fine. This will also kind of go with your own philosophy of education, but the three things you could assess are behavior, how the kids are doing behaviorally, their practices, so how are they at design investigations, that kind of thing, and then kind of the content is the third thing that you could assess. So as we're going through each of these, those are considerations to keep in mind of what of this are you going to give feedback on, what of this are you actually going to assess. All right, so let's dive into some assessment options. I think this is probably why most of you are here. I want to spend a lot of our time talking through 6 kind of options for assessing ADI. There are others, but these are ones I want to dig in on, give you some tips and tricks. I think a lot of these make really good formative assessments, although you could come up with ways to use several of them as a summative assessment as well if needed. The first one we're going to look at is the investigation report. This is something that people naturally tend to grade. So the students, they go through the whole lab, they write up their lab report, they peer edit it, and they turn it in. And this allows you to kind of measure their content knowledge if you're looking at this, but it also gives you a chance to communicate or to get an idea of how they are at communicating their findings. So communication in science, huge. Having kids write about science, that's what career scientists are out there doing all the time. So this gives you a chance to assess in both ways. There are a couple ways to do that. The first one is obviously this peer review guide. You've got the students giving feedback to each other, and then it comes back to you, and you have the opportunity to score right there on that same rubric. That gives you, if you use this system, this kind of gives you a chance to see a story that's being told. So if you have them turn in their rough draft, you have the peer editing notes that they've been given, where the reviewers said no, partially, or yes, gave them feedback for no or partiallys on how to improve. You have the author right here on this same report telling you, hey, they said this wasn't there, but it was, or I decided to change this because of whatever, I agreed with them that that wasn't where it should have been. So if you've got those things kind of all there, you get a better picture of the story of this, and then when you go to make your score, you're starting a little better off. On this teacher scoring rubric, I do want to say that the first couple of times kids do ADI labs, we want them to grow over time. We're not expecting perfection at the beginning. So we left these 0, 1, and 2 intentionally vague so that you can decide what that means with your team, with your PLC, with your planning partner, just on your own. And that may not be the same all year. A 0, a 1, and a 2 might look a little different at the beginning of the year on students' first ADI ever than it looks at the end of the year when you're holding them to a kind of a higher standard. So you can decide that as you will, but that this is one of those huge places where the feedback and the grades, this was one where I was really seeing problems with that in my own classroom. The this section, if you notice how small this little teacher comment box is, it's small like that for a reason. The reality is that we want kids to grow and learn from the peer review process, and we want them to talk with each other about what good writing looks like and develop shared norms with each other. And I was spending, like I said, hours and hours giving them really detailed comments that they weren't looking at, when really what I could have been doing, what I should have been doing, is maybe one glow and one grow for that paper, something I really loved about what they did, and then maybe one thing to think about. When kids get their papers back, most of them are going to look at the grade, at what you circled, and they're going to say, okay, I see why, without a lot of explanation on your part. But I always left my classroom open for kids to sign up for conferences with me if they wanted clarification on why I scored it a certain way. And then we were able to have a conversation about it instead of me trying to leave, 10 comments on each paper, and then 1, they didn't look at them, and 2, they didn't know what they meant when they did look at them. So I would say limit yourself there and focus in on the feedback they're giving each other, and then kind of let this, be a quick check-in for you on how they're doing, but don't spend tons and tons of time on this. Another option for grading these is peer grade. Peer grade's great because it allows the kids to peer review each other's papers. This is kind of what it looks like in the student view. They get their paper on the left and the rubric on the right. And then if they say no or partially, it pops up with a little box and says, why did you say that? And so they can leave that same kind of feedback as the paper rubric. But then as a teacher, you can see the comments that they're making. So the great thing about this program, if you're choosing to use it, is that you can see not only how they're doing at communicating on their own papers, but you can track kind of group by group or student by student, how they're doing on giving feedback to each other. So that's another kind of formative assessment. It's kind of one of those informal background skills to the ADI process that this allows you to kind of see where kids are at, use it as a formative assessment, do a mini lesson on how to give even better feedback based on where they are. But that was the kind of thinking that it wasn't being made visible for me in the past. And with peer grade, or even just looking back over those review sheets, you can get a little bit more information about your students. Okay, a second assessment option is to do the checkout questions in the books. So these are at the end of every chapter in the books. If you don't have the book, or you can make these up on your own, but it's basically after the lab is over, you give them some follow-up questions to see, did you understand the scientific concepts? You've got the paper there to say, did you understand it in this lab? And how are you at communicating? And then you've got the checkout questions that are more of a piece that you can use to see, just can you apply it to a new situation? Can you use the vocabulary that we were trying to get you to get? The elementary books come with a little rubric for each checkout question. I would say that's a really valuable thing as a teacher, to just maybe talk with someone else about what good answers look like on this. You don't necessarily have to make it into a full rubric, but just kind of thinking through, what does good writing look like for these questions? What am I thinking of? And you can also use these as a starting point for your own assessment. But the idea here again is that they're applying this in a new situation, and you get information about where they're at so that you know who to pull into small groups, who's ready for an extension, that sort of thing. So that's the two big end of ADI assessment pieces, the lab report and the checkout questions. But there's lots and lots of opportunities to assess students as you go through the lab. One of them is to look at their lab proposals. So these are some elementary lab proposals. On the magnetic force lab, they put two magnets together on a ruler, and then they try to see how the distance between the two magnets affects the force strength. So they see, sometimes they'll test how far they move away from each other, or how far they can be away from each other before they attract. There's lots of ways to design this one. But before they get to start, right, they fill out this whole proposal. And this is such a great moment as a teacher to get a feel for how your class is doing. We don't want these proposals to have to be, some 47-point super detailed thing, but you get an idea of how they are as experiment designers from this. So here we've got place the magnets close together, hold one magnet, let the other go, measure how far they repel. You get a general idea of what they're planning there, but not the specifics. So you can walk up to that group and say, hey, that looks like a really good starting place. Can you give me some of the things that you are thinking here? Like, can you give me some of the distances that you're going to use? And then, just push them on to that next step. On the one on the right, they've got a lot more detail here. They did say something like collect the data, which always makes me giggle when they do that. But this is a chance for you to check in group by group and do just a little quick verbal formative assessment on what they know, what they're thinking. And I think this is a really strong option that we don't always think of as an assessment. All right, next up is the whiteboard. So I think of the proposals as sort of a group level assessment. I'm looking at students as they work with their group. For me, whiteboards, I almost step back and look at my class as a whole. So you can also do group level assessment here, but also you can wander around. I usually kind of wandered around as they were doing their argumentation session and took notes on how, which ideas I needed to make sure to cover in the debrief, the reflective discussion, any misconceptions that I was seeing across the board, a group that did a really great job communicating that I would want to, show that off for other people. Sometimes it was things like, wow, everyone in my class chose to use a bar graph. I should make an anchor chart on different kinds of graphs they can use. So this for me was a really class level moment, and I was listening into groups and I was listening into kids and trying to get a feel for where they were at. But that was a huge kind of, again, assessment piece that I wasn't thinking of as assessment of your class. All right, next option is exit tickets. So if you're thinking of the behavioral, the social, affective piece of this, there are some great exit tickets out there on having kids report that out for themselves. So they self-assess at the end of the day. This is their ticket out the door on how'd you do? How did you do? Not how are you scientifically, but did you feel like you, were doing the science? Were you being a good group member? And that's such a huge part of becoming an adult human is learning how to work in groups with other people. So this allows you to kind of put a few key behaviors on a pedestal with or without a grade attached to it. You could celebrate this, but I think that just having kids reflect on this moment and then looking at it is really valuable. Another thing you can do is combine that with sort of a teacher overview of the class. So again, I don't know if you assign a grade to this or not. That I might have just used this as some data for, conferences with students or parent conferences, or just to kind of build the class up and say, wow, as I was wandering around, I was seeing so many people on task, completing the task and contributing meaningfully. So you can kind of use this to celebrate, again, those great things. But I think what's really interesting here is if you take these two in combination, if you look at the student exit ticket and how they feel about what they were doing, and then the teacher feedback version of that, and see how you felt they were doing, I think that leads to some very interesting conversations. And so that's just, again, another way to get to know your students. That's what all of this is about, is we want to, it's easier to make instructional decisions when we have solid information about what our students know already. So all of these tools are just giving you more information to use, and again, assign a grade to that or don't, but it's just giving you a chance to know your people better so that you can help them get on to whatever the next step is. The last option is some rubrics. So this is a great tool to use. This is used by Andrea Harrison. She's a middle school science teacher in Frisco, Texas. And she uses these to quickly go around to the groups and kind of assess how they're doing. So she has some look fors on the proposal, and she has some look fors on the rubric, or on the argument posters. And she wanders around and just circles, and that's group by group. That's not individual. But that gives her a chance when she goes home at night to think about, where her class is at and what she can do. So this is a little bit more formal way to do what I was saying when I was looking at my class level information. This gives you a way to write that down really quickly. So that's just another tool in your toolbox. You could totally make your own for those, but that's just one more thing. So kind of going to summarize, we have those big picture decisions. What are you going to grade? What's going to count as a formative grade, where you're using it to build onto the next thing? What's going to count as a summative grade, where like this is it for you? Another thing we didn't talk about much, just to kind of throw it in here, is with standards-based grading. If you're building out your standards for ADI as the science and engineering practices, or the your process skills, however you say that in your state, this is a great place to have really clear assessments of each of those. And then for assessment options, we went through 6 options there really quickly, so feel free to watch this back over again, and let us know on Twitter or Facebook group, like email us, let us know what are some ways that you're assessing your students that are working really well. So that's it for me. I'm going to pass the mic back over to Jen. Thank you so much, and I'll be back for Q&A in a minute.
All right, thanks, Gary. We wanted to share a couple of resources that can really help you as you implement ADI and as you consider your grading practices. Gary mentioned that the investigations also have checkout questions. You will find those in each of the books. We have 3rd and 4th grade. For middle school, there is life science, physical science, and earth and space science, which actually goes from grades 6 to 10. And then for high school, specifically, we have biology, chemistry, and physics volume 1, which covers mechanics. If you are interested, each of those books on our website, argument-driveninquiry.com, has a sample chapter. It includes actually a couple chapters, the front matter of the book, including the table of contents, which is really useful if you are trying to decide which investigations you want to do. And then you can see a complete investigation as shown there if you go to the read inside. It's way down at the bottom of the product description, but they are all there. You can actually read a chapter and see how it might fit with your rating. And you will see, I believe, the checkout questions for that investigation also. Along with that, to scaffold for support, you saw one of the investigation proposals for elementary. Those are actually embedded in the investigations. But for secondary, they are available on our downloadable materials under free resources. That's also where you'll find the peer review guides, which are in the books also. And then there are additional scaffolding materials available, and these are just to provide support as teachers need them. And then a couple of subject areas have some assessments that were developed as part of ADI's research. So if you're looking at more three-dimensional ways to assess students, those are available. In addition to lots of things to help you directly in your classroom that you can use in your classroom, we have videos in case you are needing a refresher or you are unfamiliar with ADI and want to see it in action. We have some great videos of each of the 8 stages. And if you are in need of some professional development, we have got you covered. We have a lot of events coming up. In just, I think, 2 short weeks, we will be in Georgetown, Texas, just north of Austin, for Argument-Driven Engineering. This is a program we're really excited about. Argument-Driven Engineering addresses the 4 engineering sort of challenges that are embedded in the NGSS for middle school. So this is our first public workshop for that. It is not too late to register and make your travel plans and join us. And it's not as hot as it has been, so it should be a great week to be in the Austin area. We have a series of one-day introductory workshops coming up all across the United States. The next ones are in Pendleton, Oregon for elementary and secondary. And then we will be in, I hope I pronounced this right, Worcester, Massachusetts for a secondary. But if you go to argumentdriveninquiry.com events, you will, you will be able to click and see all of those offerings that we have. We also have Train the Trainer offerings. So if you're interested in implementing ADI across your district and would like to be a certified ADI trainer for your district, we have some coming up in the fall. Then there's going to be, we'll be at Atlanta in the spring and in Dallas, Texas again in the summertime. So if you are interested in that, please follow us on social media or make sure you're on our listserv and we will send that out. And then, as you know, we do offer webinars because you're either watching one recorded or you're joining us live this evening. Those webinars are posted on the website under free resources. So the next one will be a question and answer with an ADI instructor on October 16th. And the previous webinars can always be viewed there as well. All right, so I have a question. We had a question about, can these be adapted to cover competencies which include the cross-cutting standards such as science and engineering practices, patterns, systems and models, cause and effect? So the question is, the person will be starting an ADI tomorrow that is Gravity and Orbits, which is Lab 3 from Earth and Space Science. And she's making rubrics tonight that will be helpful to be able to adapt the restructuring of our assessment piece. So Carrie, what is your advice on altering what we have and creating rubrics which this person is required to use according to their district?
Okay, so when you are creating rubrics, I would say be thinking through the kind of the levels that you're having the students, what you're looking for and what's realistic to be looking for now, but also in the future. So I would say don't use your rubric, punitively. Maybe go for a rubric that's really has room for them to grow, but meets them, but has levels for where they're at now. So for like the proposals, recognizing that right now in this first one, they're probably not going to be like the most detailed proposal. They're not going to have everything that you need. So if you're teaching, that was a middle school lab.
It's an Earth and Space Science, but this person has actually already done 4 ADIs.
Okay, so you know where they're at. So the students will be sorry, she said that it's a, I don't know if you already heard that, it's a person doing their 4th or 5th ADI. So you've seen your students grow, and you probably have an idea of where what's what's they're doing well and the things that they're doing less well. So that's what I would focus on, is stage by stage. I think the great ones to focus on are the investigation proposal, the whiteboards, the lab report, and the checkout questions. And then if you want to have a behavior piece in there, have a behavior rubric that you could use. And then for each of those, just think about in your classroom, like what is the range from students who are just starting out, maybe less skilled to more skilled. What does it look like for you at the end of the day? So a really great paper in your mind has these things included. Make that the top tier of your rubric, and then yeah, but that would be the ones I would focus on, would be, your proposal, your whiteboard, and your paper, and then the checkout questions and having rubrics for those.
I would also suggest that if you haven't yet Googled like cross-cutting concepts and GSS progression matrix, you take a look at that, because what the progression matrix does is it outlines a little bit more clearly what a cross-cutting concept might entail. For example, I'm looking at cause and effect. And so it says in grades 6 through 8, students classify relationships as causal or correlational. They recognize that correlation does not necessarily imply causation. They use cause and effect relationships to predict phenomena in natural or design systems. They also understand that phenomena may have more than one cause, and some cause and effect relationships in systems can only be described using probability. So I think you could also break down each of your competencies as you're referring to these cross-cutting concepts into those different areas. And the nice thing about the NGSS progression matrix, which exists for both the science and engineering practices and the cross-cutting concepts, is it gives you for grades K2 what that looks like, grades 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. So that can kind of inform where on that continuum the students should be. Because you can think about, all right, maybe they can classify a relationship as either causal or correlational, but they confuse the two, might be a level 1, but have they mastered that? The nuances of that, but they still don't know about correlation, not necessarily in causation, that might be a 2. But if they recognize the difference between causal or correlational, and that correlation does not imply causation, maybe that's a level 3. So I think if you need kind of a breakdown, if your standards don't have that for you, I would check out the, again, they're called the progression matrices. And I believe they are available online. I'm finding it at the National Academies Press. And I believe this is actually the Appendix G is the cross-cutting concepts. And I know the science and engineering practices are also available, and that's a very similar matrix.
Cool. So one other question popped up there while you were talking, and said, I've been trying to figure out what to do once I know what my students get or don't get. Do you have any suggestions on how to help get students to the next step without just telling them what to do better? And I love that question. I think that it's a really hard thing, right? Like we all want to jump in and help when we see things students aren't doing well. So the first thing is to kind of recognize that this is a process and they get better through multiple rounds of ADI. We're not expecting perfection at the beginning. And the other thing is we have some things like, we call them talk moves, so different strategies to use. And we're going to have a webinar on that coming up in, let's see, I guess it'll be in December. I'll put it on the calendar. We're going to have a webinar coming up on that soon to help kind of figure out how do you get students to the next stage, like exactly what you just asked, because that's something we hear and see a lot. So thank you for asking that, and we will have a webinar for you eventually soon.
And a couple other things. Apparently, Worcester was pronounced, except I'm pronouncing the R. Sorry, Worcester. Y'all got to give us some credit. We're from Texas, okay? And then someone mentioned that NGSS on the NSDA site also has a very good format for the matrices. And thank you for that reminder, because they do have a breakdown there that's a pretty nice version of it.
All right. I think that is it for our time today. Keep an eye on, social media. I want to draw you back to our argument driven for the Twitter, and then we've got this YouTube channel. The video will be going out on the YouTube channel the next day or two, And then you can always find us on Facebook. Facebook and this Twitter are great places to contact us, but you can also rewind in the video a little bit and email us if that helps. Yeah, so that's it. So we will see you next time. Thank you so much for hanging out with us, and we look forward to hearing your questions.